Thank you, choir, for sharing that. And it's a very true message, what they're saying, that our life would be a voice for God. And actually, in very literal ways, that's what the prophets did. God would have them do certain things, and they would actually almost act these things out as trying to be God's voice for these people, that they would literally be able to see it. And of course, God uses our lives to do that as well, as we're called to be a voice for Him, and we do that in lots of ways. We do that in just the way that we live our life. And as I conclude my series, this being the last Sunday for this particular series, Trading Our Broken Cisterns for Living Water, I've been kind of going through different pieces of the book of Jeremiah to illustrate what that first verse I read for you when we began this, which was going to be the kind of verse I used to be the stepping stone for everything else, and that was in Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 13. My people have committed two sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water. And of course, Jeremiah using something very familiar to them to illustrate for them what it looked like in terms of what they were going to in rejecting this relationship God offered to them and worshiping these idols and these false gods that the other cultures and religions around them were worshiping. And Jeremiah is saying, you are walking to these broken cisterns that are cracked up and dry, and there's no life there, when God is offering you the fountain, the spring of living water, which is what it looks like to follow Him. So Jeremiah used that image in the beginning of what his book is, and that image I've been using to illustrate a couple of different points about that and how what Jeremiah is saying influences and has an impact on our lives today in the 21st century as it pertains to truth, as it pertains to meaning and significance in life, and this morning as it pertains to a hope and a destiny, as it pertains to future. And what that means. What does that look like for us as believers, and how does that impact, and what does that mean for us putting our faith and our hope in Jesus for our eternity? And so I want to kind of explain that a little bit and see how Jeremiah shared that with the people of his day. And I want to do that first by sharing with you an article that I just found one, but they're pretty common. I've read a number of them. And the article headline was this: Will technology help us live forever? And it came out of the UK Telegraph, but I've found them in different places as well. But that was the article headline: Can technology help us live forever? And one of the blurbs in the article says, founders of the world's most well-known companies, from Google to PayPal and Oracle, are pumping hundreds of millions of dollars into defying death. And so then it listed some of the people that own these companies and how much millions, hundreds of millions of dollars they're putting into technology. It's a lot of technology CEOs in that world that is pumping money into research and figuring this out. How can we live forever in defying death? And so there's hundreds of millions of dollars going into research to answer that question. How can I live forever? And one of the quotes was this. There was a huge, if you've ever heard of Davos, which is where these economic and financial big shots, leaders of the world, of the financial world, get together. And in that meeting, it was envisioned the future of work in 2100. So this is what they think in the year 2100, and we get to there. They think we could be living in a time where everyone is living up to the age of 200. And so they were talking about this in relation to work. So that means if you were looking to retire, like when you're 65 or 70, I don't think so. If you're retired now, you'd still be at work. This means for me, in 2100, I'll be roughly 118. So if we're living for till 200, I could serve this church for like 80 years. I could go to the next church and I'd still be the young guy on the block. They'd be like, our last pastor was like 180. You're 118. I'm still the young pastor. So this is what they think work could be like, living to 200 years old. And this is what they're seeking to do. If we can hack the aging process of cells and reverse it, we can potentially live indefinitely. This is what the article is saying. There are people out there that call themselves transhumanists, which means they are trying to figure out how they can live forever. They are trying to defy what we all know is reality, and somehow, through technology, there's people actually putting like chips in their fingers, and they're just doing weird stuff to change their cells to live forever. The problem with that is they still don't answer the question of what happens when you walk out in the street and you get hit by a bus. They haven't stopped that from happening. You can't. I guess they're assuming that they're not going to have anything bad happen to them. The reality is you can't escape this reality of where there's a time to be born in Ecclesiastes, it says, and a time to die. And that is the reality that we live in. And so this life that we have offers many difficulties, offers many struggles, offers lots to us. And we know that ultimately it leads to this. Even if technology is trying to change it, you and I know we can't. And so God has something to say about that, and Jeremiah, I think, captures that well in what he's saying to Israel and what's going on in Israel's day. And where we end up matters for our life now. Why knowing our destiny and answering the question of what happens after all this is over has an impact on our lives in the here and now, in the everyday. And it's clear for that for the Jews in Jeremiah's day, and I think we'll see it's clear for us too in our day. So I want to just look at Jeremiah chapter 29. And the verses I'm going to read for you one of them is very familiar, quoted a lot in lots of different places. But I want to try and develop some context around what that verse is explaining and what that verse is talking about in Jeremiah 29. And you know that Jeremiah is trying to help Israel and the Jews who have been exiled to turn from following after these false gods, which we know are broken cisterns, and following the one true God who began this covenant, this relationship with them. And Jeremiah is trying to tell them that they're following after these things that are going to leave them empty and dry and ultimately lead to death. There's nothing behind them, and he's trying to convince them to turn back to God. So he's doing that in different ways. I shared some of that in the last couple of messages. But this one in particular is talking about Jeremiah encouraging the Jews to settle down in the land that they're in. So as I shared with you, God was judging Israel for worshiping these false gods that were destroying their lives and leading them to these broken cisterns, and he exiled them. So the empire of the day was Babylon. So Babylon came in, swept through there, and they took a whole bunch of Jews to Babylon, to this place far from the promised land. And so now there are Jews living there. And so through Jeremiah's ministry, I said of about 45 years of ministry, in this time frame, that arrow 594, this is when this is taking place, approximately, that Jeremiah is writing this letter. Chapter 29 is like a letter that he is writing from back in the Egypt area and back in Jerusalem area, and he's writing this letter to the Jews in Babylon. And he's telling them, you need to settle down there. In verses 1 through 9, Jeremiah of chapter 29, Jeremiah is basically telling them that. You need to plant gardens and eat from those gardens. You need to live in the land. You need to marry and give in marriage and have sons and daughters, and don't decrease but increase. Plan on putting some roots down there because you're going to be there for a while, is what Jeremiah is saying to them. He even says to them, you need to pray for the well-being of your captors, of the empire that took you. Jeremiah says you need to pray that things go well within that empire, which is not what they wanted to hear. And the problem that was happening was there were people sending reports back to Babylon. There were prophets telling all these Jews that were in exile that they shouldn't do any of that because it's going to be short. God is going to judge them. He's going to judge Babylon quickly, and it's only going to be like they were saying a 2-year exile, and that God's deliverance of the Jews and bringing them back to this promised land would be swift. And Jeremiah was saying that's not the message that God is giving to you. And so now Jeremiah is trying to refute that. And he sends this letter there telling them to do this, telling them to settle down in the land because God's judgment is not going to be swift. We know from ancient historical literature that in the Babylonian Empire, during this time, there was some upheaval. There were some things going on internally that we know there was issues that probably these prophets were going off of the things that they were seeing and saying, well, that must be God, and he's going to judge them, and the exile won't be very long. And Jeremiah has something different to say. He says this in verse 10. After he tells them to settle down in the land, after he says to don't decrease but increase, to marry and give in marriage, and to pray for the city in which, or the land in which you are exiled, Jeremiah says this in verse 10 of chapter 29. This is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and to not harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. So Jeremiah is saying to the Jews there, and you hear that in the very first verse, this letter that he is back in the homeland. He's in Jerusalem area and Egypt area because eventually they kick him out of there and send him down to Egypt because they don't like what he's saying. And he's sending this letter from there to these people in exile in Babylon. And he's basically refuting the lies of the prophets, saying that this is going to be a swift exile. And he says that in verse 10, when Babylon's 70 years are completed. Jeremiah is basically prophesying that you are going to be in exile for these 70 years. It's not going to be quick. You're going to be there for 70 years. Plan on that. Plan on being there for 70 years. Obviously, that message probably wasn't very popular, but God's judgment of Israel was going to be such that hopefully what would happen after this is what Jeremiah said later in those verses. Hopefully after this, the people of Israel would then call on God and come and pray to him. And God says, I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. That's what God was trying to accomplish here. He wanted them to seek him with all their heart. And Jeremiah says it's going to be at least 70 years until God delivers you from this exile. So Jeremiah was sharing with them this promise, the future, the hope, the destiny mattered in the here and now for them. And that's what this promise is to the Jews. When you hear that verse read, because I've heard it read in lots of different places, Jeremiah 29:11, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. That verse is connected to this, where Jeremiah is telling them that. But it's not going to happen tomorrow. It's going to happen 70 years from now, is what Jeremiah is saying. It's not instantaneous. This promise that God has given is not instantaneous. This future, this destiny, this promise, this hope that God gives is there to help you get to that point. Because you're going to have 70 years until that happens. But what God is looking for is that you would seek Him with all of your heart. God's thoughts for His people were for their welfare. That word that's used there, the plans to prosper you and not to harm you, that word is actually shalom, for their welfare, for their well-being, and to give them a future that they hope for. God was going to do that. That was God's promise to them. That was the future. That was their destiny. But it wasn't going to happen like that. That promise was there to give them hope as they lived out those 70 years. So that promise was contingent upon their response. When Israel responds by seeking after God with all their heart, which we know means their mind, soul, strength, everything they are, their energy. We know the heart isn't just the emotion, it's the center of you as a person, where your thoughts take place, where your decisions take place, where your will is, where your emotions are, everything there. When you seek me with all that you are, here's what I'm promising to you: a hope and a future, a destiny that was promised to your forefathers that will be realized again. That destiny, that future, was to provide them hope for the here and now, for the living in this exiled land for these 70 years. So it's not that we should assume when we read that verse that means nothing bad is ever going to happen in our lives. Jeremiah was telling this to the Jews in this land that they were exiled to. And he was telling this verse to them because they had 70 years in which they were going to be there. And their response to experiencing this hope and this future that God had was contingent upon their obedience, their loyalty, and their fellowship with Him. You cannot separate the two. God, that verse isn't just thrown out there that anybody who reads that is like, well, that's God's promise to me. That promise that God is making is contingent upon the Jews' response to Him. But that promise is for a hope and a future. Even in the midst of this difficulty that you're going through, you can cling to that promise and you can live with joy and with hope because God is going to bring it about. So as believers, as Christians, that's why I don't understand why we think that nothing bad is ever going to happen in our lives. That verse, and I know people use that verse to almost kind of whitewash all the stuff that happens and say, this is the plans that God has for me, plans for a hope and a future, and that is definitely true. But that hope and that future comes with a lot of difficulty and tragedy and suffering and pain sometimes. But it doesn't mean that it's not there. That hope in that future, that destiny is there to give us hope as we live out this life. That's what Jeremiah was trying to tell them. That's why Jeremiah inserts that verse, that promise that God gives. Even after all that they've been through, even after all the things Israel has done to throw God off their back and say, I could care less about you, God gives them that promise. After all this time, God still says, I have a hope and a future for you. That when you seek me, you will find me. When you pray to me, I will answer you. This relationship is still there. Even though you've been walking to these broken cisterns over and over again, I am still offering you the spring of living water. There was a song that I thought of that I've been hearing recently that made me think of this verse. I'm going to have Steve play that song for us in just a minute, but I could hear Jeremiah saying this or writing this or somebody singing it to the Jews who are living in exile to remind them of this relationship that God offers. And I think it's a reminder to us as well in what God offers for our future and for our destiny and why that gives us hope. So Steve, can you play that song for us?
After the pride, after the fall, the hands of mercy open wide. After the rain, after the flood, you set your promise in the sky. The God who was and is to come has been the same for me. After all these years, you've never given up. After all these years, you're constant with your love. It amazes me. After all you've done, it amazes me. You're still running after us. After the cross, after the shame, no power of hell could ever take your perfect life, your gift of grace that testifies beyond the grave, still testifies beyond the grave. After all these years, you've never given up. After all these years, you're constant with your love. It amazes me. After all you've done, it amazes me. You're still running after us. The God who was and is to come has been the same for me. The God who was and is to come has been the same for me. You've always been the same for me. After all these years, you've never given up. After all these years, you're constant with your love. It amazes me. After all you've done, it amazes me. You're still running after us. It amazes me. After all you've done, it amazes me. You're still running after us. After all these years.
After all that time, after all Israel had done, God still says to them, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." I love in that song where it says, "You're still running after us." This is what a God who is running after people does. This relationship that he offered, this relationship that took his people to these broken cisterns, God continues to run after them. And even after those 70 years, after rejecting God, he still says, "I have a plan, a future, and a hope for you." It's the same thing that God says to us. Our vision of our future life with God guides our living in the here and now. We all wrestle with present concerns, but our ultimate destiny informs our life's meaning and purpose. There was a philosopher, Soren Kierkegaard, if you've ever heard of him, that said it this way, as Christians. We define life backwards and live it forwards. It looks like this. Here's life, and you'd think life is going this way. It begins and goes to your destiny, your destination point. You have point A, you're trying to get at point B, that's your destination, and you start here. As Christians, we start at the destination. We begin there, and we work backwards. God helps us define all of our life. Our vision of our future guides how we live today, in the here and the now, because we have this promise, we have this hope of a future. We live life backwards because of what God has promised to us. That is what Jeremiah was trying to say to the Jews. That is what God says to us in the hope that we have in Jesus Christ. This is life. Life offers lots of turns and twists. When Jeremiah said these verses to the Jews, they had 70 years to look forward to of not being in their homeland. When God gives that promise to us of a hope and a future found in Jesus Christ, there's a lot of life to live yet. And that life doesn't always offer the greatest stuff. But we know that at the end of it, God offers something better. That's why we can live this life with hope, even in struggle, even in difficulty. That's why guys like Richard Wurmbrand, who started the ministry called Voice of the Martyrs, can live with hope for 13 years in a communist prison. Day after day after day, his hope is still there because of what God offers. Life doesn't mean that it's going to be easy. That verse doesn't mean that things are going to be simple in life. It means that God offers us something. He offers us life, a spring of living water. Our future and where we believe we're going, our destiny and that offering matters for the here and now because it gives us hope. That is what hope means. Does what I believe about my destiny matter now? I say yes, it does, because this is what it offers to the Christian. Hope is confidence you can have that God has a plan for you, even when you're not sure what it looks like, even when life offers some struggles, difficulties, and you're wondering, where in the world am I going? Hope is a confidence that God has a plan for you. Hope is a confidence that God has a purpose for whatever you're going through. Why am I doing this? Why is this happening? That hope says that God has a purpose in this. And even if I don't know what it is, I know the God in whom I trust. I know the God that says He is running after me. I know the God who says He's got a hope and a future for me, even though I don't know why I'm going through this right now. That, to me, helps me in life. Everybody has some kind of crutch. People say Christianity is just a crutch. People's explanation for death, people's explanation for getting through suffering, they might not call it Christianity, but it is a crutch. Christianity is not a crutch. It is an answer to these questions, and it is a way of doing life. Because we have a God who says this, as Jeremiah reminded the Jews, we have a God who says that to us, that He has a plan for us, a purpose for us, a destiny for us. We can have and live with hope. No matter what life throws at us, no matter if I got to live in this land for 70 years in exile, or I got to go through this stuff that I'm going through right now, I know that there is a God who is running after me to have this relationship with me. And so where I put my hope, where I believe my future lies, the Jews said it was lying in these broken cisterns, and they walked to it, and there was nothing there. God says, I offer it to you in a relationship with me, and when you walk to it, there is a spring of living water. Jesus said it this way, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. There is a way to live forever. That article is right. You can live forever. That life happens in a relationship with God. It doesn't happen through technology. The hope that we have as Christians is offered to us in Jesus Christ. The hope that we have in this life, even amid the difficulties and the struggles that we have, we can weather those storms because we know there is a God who is pursuing us with this relationship, who seeks after us to answer our prayers, to hear from us, because he's offering us a hope and a future. Life is found in the spring of living water. If you are looking for life elsewhere, if you are struggling with life, maybe you need to go back to this spring of living water. Maybe you needed to be reminded that God offers us something. Even in the midst of the struggle, that's what Jeremiah was saying. In these 70 years, here is the promise that is out there. It never goes away. You are constant in your love. As many times as they rejected him, thrown him off their back, God still comes back and says, this is the plan I have for you. As many times as we have been angry at God, maybe went our own way, questioned God, questioned what he's doing, that path is always there. That spring is always flowing. God is always offering that to us. If you are looking for hope in this life, it's found in a relationship with Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the only one. This passage I read for you came from the gospel where the story is being told that Lazarus is dead and Mary and Martha are upset because Jesus wasn't there in time to heal him. And Jesus gets there and it doesn't matter because Jesus brings him back to life. That's the hope that we have. This life is not the end. This life is only the beginning to what God has in store for us. And you can live this life with joy and with hope because of that promise. So we live as Christians, we live our life backwards. Because of that promise, I have answers to these questions and experiences and difficulties and choices. Because my hope is placed not in this broken cistern, that when I walk to it looking for life, there's nothing there. It's offered to us in this spring of living water that is a relationship with God through Jesus Christ. Let's pray. God, I thank you for the promise that you've given to us of a hope and a future. A promise that as we live this life and maybe go through some difficulties and struggles, we can always go back to that spring that offers living water. Lord, if we maybe have been walking to some of those broken cisterns in our own life, I pray that you would help us to find that path that leads back to the spring of living water. The hope that you offer us in a relationship with you, Lord. If we have friends, people in our life that we are watching go back to these broken cisterns, Lord, I'm asking that you would give us the words that our life, as our choir sang, might be a voice to them about who this God is. This God that after all these years, even after all the times of trying to go our own way, that path is always there. That water is always flowing, and it's always being offered to us because of who you are, because of your constant love. You can tell us, as you told the Jews, that you have a plan for our lives, a hope, a plans for our welfare and not to harm us, plans to give us a future. Lord, we thank you for that, and may that change and influence the way we live our life in the here and now. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.